Jeremy, would you mind popping up those slides?
Absolutely.
So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome everyone to the SecurityBoulevard.com program brought to you by Techstrong and ThreatX. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting presentation ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, maybe you'd like to rewatch or even share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. That's also where you're going to find the chat tab, and we'd like you to reserve that for more general comments. So any feedback to something you hear about today's program, or if you want to start getting it warmed up right now, let us know where you're tuning in. We will have a couple of polls that will be launching throughout today's program, so please keep an ear and an eye open for those, as we'd really like your feedback. And if you navigate to the handouts panel, you'll see a couple of resources available for download, so feel free to grab those. And my final reminder, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our session today is called Left, Right, and In Between, Thinking About API Security. And joining me again on Techstrong Learning is Jeremy Ventura, Field CISO at ThreatX. And we're also joined by Tanya Jenka, CEO and founder at WeHackPurple. So Jeremy, Tanya, thank you both so much for being here with me. I'm going to look at our agenda before I turn the floor over to you. So we're going to start with some key questions to consider as we build an API security strategy. Then we're going to hear from our experts on some lessons they've learned in the trenches. So we'll hear about their wartime experiences. And of course, some best practices for securing APIs left, right, and in between. So Jeremy and Tanya, thank you both for having me, and thank you for being here. I'll turn the program over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you to Techstrong for having myself and Tanya. I'll introduce myself first, Tanya, and then I'll hand it over to you. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Jeremy Ventura, as Cody mentioned. I am the Director of Security and Field CISO with ThreatX, a leading API attack protection company. And my background is working for a lot of different security vendors in many different roles, from engineering to internal security to advising organizations, from security vendors all the way to working in internal security. So I'm excited to be here. Tanya, I'm super excited to be doing this webinar with you. I've been following you for a long time, so really appreciate you joining us today. And Tanya, I'll hand it over to you for a quick intro.
I've been following you back, Jeremy. Anyone who listens to my podcast, I'm trying to convince them to come on. I'm very subtle. So I'm Tanya Jenka, and I'm from WeHackPurple. I founded that company, and we're a community, an academy, a podcast, and a ton of blogs. It's just all about application security. And so when Jeremy said, did you want to talk about how to secure APIs? It's like, do I ever?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tanya, again. And this is going to be a super exciting conversation. Look forward to having this with you. So as Cody mentioned, we've got a couple different agenda items that we want to talk about. And I think really just kicking it off, sometimes when we come on these Techstrong webinars, not everyone is an expert in the topic that we're talking about. And so when we talk about API security or application programming interface security, Tanya, I'll first kick it off to you, and I know you've done a lot of work in education of the world and cybersecurity in general. What does API security really mean to you?
So generally, when a lot of people talk about APIs right now, what they're talking about is web APIs. They're not usually talking about an API that's in the back end of your Windows host system. They're talking about, I have a web front end and it's sending questions through the API to the database, to a serverless app, to another app, to wherever it's going. And so an API is kind of the in-between a web application and either another web application, a database, or whatever. And it's almost like a web app with no front end, but usually they're quite small and you'll have a whole bunch of them behind one front end. And so we want to secure those because they have the keys to the kingdom. They can talk to our database, they can talk to our servers, our secret management tools, etc. And so I really, really want people to pay more attention to them, Jeremy.
Oh, absolutely. And just to piggyback on that, it's funny because I was actually speaking to a university not that long ago, and they were asking me a little bit about ThreadX and kind of the work in the field that I'm in. And they were asking, like, explain APIs just in general, like for someone that's never even experienced that before. And I think one of the ways I don't know, it's something funny I've always kind of did an analogy with was almost looking at like the tentacles, like an octopus, like and looking at the tentacles that allow you to connect to another device or two systems connecting to each other. And as we know, it's not just necessarily two systems. It could be hundreds of thousands of systems and how those informations share data or transfer data to each other. And I think the analogy I used was because it was a university, they had a mobile app, and the mobile app allowed them actually to order food ahead of time at like the university's cafeteria. And so when they went on the app, they said, okay, I want to order this food and I want to go and get this delivered and picked up at a certain time. And I said, do you know actually how that's happening? I was like, it's probably an API call that's going backwards, that's taking this application and allowing you to get your chicken wings on Friday at 6 o'clock p.m. And it was such a funny analogy, but they're like, oh, you saw the light bulbs go off. And I said to them, but you know why this is such a heavy business and why security individuals and organizations are looking at this is because teams are building APIs at light speed. We run on APIs and web applications. And I think, when we look at some of the typical breaches that we can cover later that have happened when it comes to APIs or, the misuse of them, the misconfiguration of them, or the vulnerabilities that are in these APIs, it's really becoming a serious challenge and threat for especially security teams to kind of keep up. And so, Tanya, I think one of the biggest struggles that I know personally I've seen in the industry is who's responsible? Is it engineering who's building these and dev? Is it security? So I know you've worked with thousands of organizations consulting. So I'd love to just kind of pick your brain a little bit more on maybe even some of the stories of, does it change? Does ownership change depending on your industry or depending on the organization?
Oh my gosh, Jeremy, that's like the most difficult question of all time. And I'm not going to do the super lame, it depends. But so I believe it's every person's job to do their own job as securely as they know how. And then I believe it's the security team's job to help everyone know how to do their job securely. And that might be providing tools, teaching them, making a policy, going and reviewing the API for them and saying, hey, so I was talking to your API and it let me say a lot of stuff I shouldn't. And so we need the API to be a bit less agreeable with malicious actors, whatever the case may be. And so I feel like it's a partnership. Ideally, in my opinion, the security team should come up with policies and guidance, especially you and I were talking about if we can make it one page, life is better for everyone. And so it's like, we want these 8 things. If you're going to make an API and it's going to be public facing, we want to be behind a gateway or this, and that, let's say, and then help them actually reach it. So that might mean acquiring a gateway or a mesh or whatever it is, implementing it, and then showing them how to use it or buying licenses or teaching them. There's just, I really believe that it's a partnership. Security cannot do it on our own. I've tried and it didn't go well.
Yeah. And I've seen that, and we've seen that with our prospects, and just, even talking to other industry leaders where this is quite the challenge, where sometimes I think a lot of it comes down to kind of where security fits in an organization. That's a broader conversation we can have. But, how do we make sure that we're building secure applications and secure code while not slowing down engineering and ultimately the business, right? At the end of the day, business is going to move. And, we're going to develop, we're going to build, we're going to get new customers. We need revenue. That's what this is. But taking the approach that security is also a business problem is also super huge in how we articulate, or the acumen that we use to get that buy-in. And I know at the end of this presentation webinar, we're going to talk about some of the different best practices and tips we've learned from the field and what everyone in this webinar can take away from them. And so we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how do you build that buy-in and how do you get that influence. But Tanya, I think this is a perfect kind of first pass at this whole world of API security. There's, including ThreadX, including companies you've worked for, there's a lot of vendors in this space. And it can become somewhat confusing, in my personal opinion, because you've got vendors saying you need a shift left. And what that means, and I know you'll explain a little bit more, but you need to be part of the CI/CD build pipeline. You need to be part of that DevSecOps. You need to implement these security technologies part of your coding. And then we've got vendors that are somewhere in the middle, looking at schema management and configuration and that vulnerability part. And then you've got vendors all the way to the right-hand side, which is all about incident response and maybe proactive and attack protection. So, Tanya, I know you've wrote a lot of publications. You've got award-winning books out there. And I want to pick your brain a little bit more for the audience. I guess let's break these down. Let's talk a little bit first about shift left, the importance of that. What is it? What are the different capabilities in there?
Okay, Jeremy. So Jeremy and I have been doing security a while. When we started doing security, you would build the app and then maybe 2 or 3 weeks before you were going to production, and like you've worked on it 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. Then the security team shows up at the end and we tell you how wrong you are. And I remember one day a dev saying to me, well, can't you just tell me what you want at the start? Because wouldn't that be easier? And this was when I had started saying we should shift left, we should move things left, push left, come on. So what shift left or push left means is if you imagine the system development lifecycle written out on a piece of paper. I don't know if I'm mirrored or not, so it might be confusing, but basically it goes at the beginning: requirements, design, coding, testing, QA, all of that, and then release, maintenance, and hopefully not too much incident response if you play your cards right. And so if you go left, you're earlier in the system development lifecycle. And Jeremy and I have talked about this. Lots of us have talked about this, how vendors have started, like, and marketing folks have started saying, like, that means you buy my product. I'm like, no, that's not what it means. It means, like, you can use lots of products, but it's a lot about the processes. It's a lot about you communicating from the very first kickoff meeting for the project. Hi, I'm your security human. I am here to help. I come in peace, and I want to assist you in ensuring at the end you have this awesome, secure product that's on time and delights our customers, right? I want you to get there in the same amount of speed, which means I need to start earlier and doing things differently. And so I remember looking at numbers, Jeremy, and seeing, wow, we could actually save a ton of money this way. Someone in the chat is saying, it's like a conversation instead of just being the department of no. Yeah, so I like to show up at kickoff meetings if I'm allowed, or as soon as possible. And then I like to give requirements like, oh, you're building an API? Awesome. Here's the things I need from you. Oh, is it public facing or just internal? Does it connect to sensitive data? And then, here's some stuff to go into your requirements document. And then call me if you need help doing these things, because I want you to be awesome. And that includes secure. It's just part of that package is security. Yeah. Do you have anything to add on the shifting, pushing left?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And to your point, there's a couple already chat messages here about, the conversation instead of a department of no. And I think, that's sometimes in the world of security, right? I think people look at us of like, oh, they're absolutely the gatekeepers, and we want to bring this application in, or we want to bring this new product in. No. And I think instead of no, we get into this concept of what does no mean? And I really think it's a broader discussion of risk management. And, what is our risk posture? What is our acceptance of risk? We can't necessarily be the gatekeepers or not. But sure enough, if we do our vendor due diligence and, we decide, oh, that company's not doing pen testing or the SOC 2, or they're not secure, they're not, sure enough, right? Security has the valid reasons probably to say no. But we also know that sometimes C-level executives are going to push for a product or a service or a partner that security may just have to accept. And Tanya, there's one thing that you brought up about like the API itself and what is it doing? And I think there's a whole concept here of accountability and ownership, right? Identifying what are those active APIs. And we see this a lot of the times where sometimes there's solutions out there where they're only looking at your APIs that are actually making calls. And I think a lot of the time when we think about shift and left, we're thinking about asset discovery, inventory, account ownership, even the next level, if we can, like what is the risk to the business of this API? What does it mean for our business? What is it doing, the context? And it kind of brings up a concept that I know you and I both talked about in the pre-rehearsal for this, was like rogue and zombie APIs. And I think sometimes we think about we put so much emphasis on what is these APIs doing. We're forgetting about all these APIs that maybe somebody created 5 years ago, 3 months ago, that the gateway or the firewall is not picking up because it's not necessarily sending traffic, but it's sitting there. Do you have any insight of what is the best practice to get this full, because asset management inventory is difficult. It's easier said than done. I guess, what is the best approach to take a look at that entire landscape, if it's possible?
Totally possible. It's just a lot of work. So I have a lot of pen tester friends, and they'll tell me, every 20 or 30 engagements where they're testing an API and it'll be version 2, they just change it to version 1 and it's still on and it's terrible. So yeah, you definitely are. It's still happening, unfortunately. So I think the inventory is, the answer is inventory. It's not a sexy answer, but if you don't know all the things that you need to protect, how can you sure they are protected, right? And so one of the first steps I ever do when I consult somewhere, like, okay, let's take some inventory and also give me all the scans that you've done, because I'm going to shove them into Microsoft Excel, I love Microsoft Excel, and I know it's not supposed to be used for everything, but it can be used for a lot of things. And I want to see what the top kind of problems are that you have that are reoccurring, so we can start addressing those right away and stop some bleeding, if that makes sense. Because there's usually a few things that are oh my gosh, that I want to stop immediately. And then inventory of APIs and web apps, every single thing that has some sort of web footprint, I want to know about it. I want to make sure it's at least getting one type of scan, so I can just tell, is this a complete disaster? Is this middle of the road? Or does this actually look kind of decent? And I can put it on it needs more. I do want to do more with it, but it's not right at the front of the line anymore. And so inventory has changed a lot in 2022. I know we're 2023 now. I remember, don't worry. But a whole bunch of companies came out with inventory systems that actually work. Because I've seen some really bad one. Oh, someone's like, I'm glad you mentioned Excel and not only Jira. No, I'm going to talk about Jira later. But Jeremy, you might know of something that's good at taking inventory. I don't know if you know anything about a product that might do that.
Yes, I do. I won't necessarily always highlight, the companies I work for, but I will, in the sense of that there are technologies, there are tools out there that can get into environments and really get a good, accurate picture and depiction about what's going on within the environment. It goes back again to, I think a lot of times we rely on, it's a struggle, right? Because sometimes it comes down to resourcing, right? It comes down to allocation, it comes down to budgeting, it comes down to how many people do I have on my staff to be looking at this stuff, even just get an inventory picture, never mind doing the response, which we'll talk about in a second. And, there are tools and technologies out there that can really benefit and help organizations. Now, of course, there's different ways of how to implement these technologies, whether you're going to do a reverse proxy approach, whether you can use agents, whether you're going to rely on maybe even a third party to help you with this. So there is a lot of information out there. We do have a bunch of information as well. I always invite everybody, as Cody mentioned earlier, to go check out the handouts as well. But Cody, I know Cody's in the background. Cody, we're going to actually ask our first poll question here. But when it comes to API inventory, where are you? For an organization, are you just in the beginning, just kind of understanding where it's at? Are you making progress? Are you looking at and scaling up your organization? Or would you say that you're awesome? And
nailed it.
Exactly. We've nailed it and we are perfect. So we'll let that poll run for about a minute here and get some response and talk about it as soon as it comes up. But Tanya, just as we're kind of waiting for the results here, a lot of times we've seen, there's a couple breaches as well that I can think about the top of my head where it kind of relates always back to inventory, where we didn't necessarily know that API was making those making those calls to that application, or we thought we had decommissioned it a while ago because we maybe moved to production with this application. And, it kind of brings up a kind of that sequence of, once we're talking about inventory, once we're talking about, getting that asset classification, and understanding what it is and what the risk it opposed to, we then kind of move into kind of this life cycle about, okay, now what happens? And so before we move a little bit to the shift right, and kind of when we talk about that, I think we're ready for the results, and we can talk about that. And it's exactly almost what I expected. Tanya, I don't know.
I wanted to click awesome, we've nailed it, just so I could say that for once. But I haven't got to work with very many companies where I've had one consulting phone call of my whole career where I was like, literally, I don't have a single piece of advice because you're literally doing everything awesome that I could possibly think of. And that's happened once. And I've done a lot of consulting calls in my time. So yeah, making progress, at least for the part I'm aware of and is not hidden in shadow security. I mean, I've heard of shadow IT where, someone in the business hires a developer to create something for them because they don't want to wait on those pesky IT people because there's so many silly policies in their way. But I've never seen shadow security. They're like, yeah, the business people were just like, we're not secure enough, so we hired our own security person. That would be awesome. I'd be like, cool. When do we meet them?
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for answering the first poll question. We actually have two more coming up later as we continue on. But Tanya, we talked a little bit about kind of some of those best practices, starting with inventory, everything that you had mentioned before on the shift left. As we kind of move through this infinity cycle, we then start thinking about kind of runtime security. We start thinking about shift right as well. So what are we doing when it comes to what are the APIs that are in use? What are they doing? I think a lot of it, the best thing that I tell prospects and customers and advise on is I like to use acronyms. And this is actually a military acronym that is taught to the CIA. And it is all about BAD, B-A-D, which the B stands for baseline. I think it comes back a little bit to inventory, but the next step is baselining. What are my APIs doing? What are they intended to do? What is that typical quota or that rate of traffic that they're responding per second or per minute or per month? Is this normal? From there, the BAD, the A, is anomaly. So making sure that whatever tool or technology you put in place has some people call it AI, some people call it ML, right? Taking those buzzwords out for a second, anomaly detection, keeping it really, really straightforward where I can pick out based upon the traffic, that doesn't look right. Maybe there is this API that's being hit 5x than it should be. Maybe it's normal for my business because I'm a retailer and it's around the holidays. And so we're expecting an uptick of traffic, for example. From there, while you pick up the anomalies, making sure you have a tool technology in place or the process in place here to then the D and BAD is to decide or make a decision. So BAD, baseline, anomaly, decide, or decision. And from that decision, having a tool that's built in, learning your traffic, learning what that behavior looks like to say, I want to go and block this, or maybe we need to put this on a watch list, or maybe we need to do whatever it is, X, Y, and Z, allow it because it is part of our normal occurrence of what happens to that API. And so I like to give everybody kind of that acronym of like, especially when you're explaining, kind of goes in our tips and tricks, when you're explaining kind of how do you get funding for a technology or a budget or how you build those programs. Sometimes people actually respond to acronyms, right? And not necessarily the cybersecurity acronyms and lingo that we always use. So with Shift Right, as we mentioned before, there's a bunch of tools and technologies out there, but there's some actual, I do believe, critical capabilities or core components that organizations should look at. I think when it comes to looking at IP interrogation, making sure we're looking at the IP addresses of where this is coming in, making sure we're looking at the HTTP request and understanding what is that rate limiting, what is the request coming from, providing some of that attacker or user behavioral profiling, right? Again, easier said than done, but as you are kind of going through that journey, if you're there yet or you're looking for about bringing in a technology, taking a look at some of these critical capabilities can really help eliminate what we call a lot of those false positives and making sure that your applications or APIs are running correctly. Tanya, I know I did a lot of talking there, but Anything you want to add on kind of what you've seen as far as best practices, as far as whether it's tools, technologies, building that program from that shift right approach?
I personally feel that an AppSec program sort of has two sides. And one side is the part I was previously talking about, like new apps that you're building. And you want to make sure as you're building them securely, your design's secure. All of those things, like you test it to make sure it looks good before it goes out into the wild. And then shift right is like, what happens after the SDLC, the system development lifecycle, is over? And I find quite often, and I don't mean to talk ill of anyone, but I am guilty of this as well. I'm like, exciting, a new app. Yes, 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 yes. And I'm very tempted to spend most of my efforts only on all the cool new stuff that's being built and forgetting about all those apps that make our entire business run and made us the money many years until then so that our business could be as successful as we are today. Those still need to be secure as well. And oh my gosh, monitoring, logging, etc. So I did incident response for quite a while, even when I didn't mean to. Like I'd be hired as the AppSec person. I'd be like, oh no, this API keeps falling down and it's for bad reasons. And we look into it, something bad has happened, figuring out how to do the thing. And like, this might sound ridiculous, Jeremy, but I still hear constantly, oh, well, logging's too expensive, so our APIs have no logs. And I'm like, well, now I'm an incident responder and I have nothing to investigate. Like, what am I supposed to go look at if the API has no logs? You know, your database, so hopefully your database has logging. And like, oh, and there was no monitoring. So the way we found out that it was down was because a client called us and complained. Like, no. I want our team to be the first team to know that our app is down, and I want to be back up before clients call us. And if we're being attacked, I need to know immediately. Yes. And so I don't like, are we going to like talk about like specific recommendations for after things have been deployed, like specific products? Or did you want to talk about like some of the things that we should do there, like logging and monitoring and alerting on anomalies, like you said, ensuring we have a good incident response process, stuff like that?
Yeah, definitely the latter there, where I think it's more because there's so many tools and technologies out there. And I think it's really deciphering about what is those best practices and strategies. Not every, I used to work for IBM on their incident response team as well. And a lot of it was consulting gigs because organizations didn't have the resources for incident responders, or the attack volume was so high. Alert fatigue is a real thing, especially when we start talking about APIs and web applications, right? We know we've got all the different types of attacks, right? And there's great stuff from OWASP about how they categorize web apps, how they categorize API, and that's another great resources for everybody to kind of go take a look at, the OWASP top 10 for web apps and APIs, understanding what those attacks are. But when you're looking at just the raw data that's coming in from some of these technologies out there, whether it's a WAF or a gateway or a specific tool, it's a lot. Like the volume of these alerts, how do you pick through what should I actually focus on? Prioritization is a real thing, not just when it comes to APIs, but in general in security. And Tanya, I guess, from even your background in incident response, and how do you help? Like, is there a secret that people just can be like, oh, yep, Tanya said it. That's exactly what it is. Where, and I already know the answer to this one, but is there a secret sauce there about how do I help prioritize? We talked a little bit about inventory. I think that does kind of take a big approach here, kind of the risk-based scoring. But anyway, I'll kind of open it up to you of like, what have you seen as far as prioritization?
So I often prescribe, so if you're going to create a custom app and that includes APIs, I want my API to be able to call for help if it needs it. And that might sound ridiculous, but one of the last places, I don't know, I did a lot of deving. And what we did is we created an API error handler, and it would just collect logs from everyone and put them together. And it's like, okay, so if you get 5 calls for help from the same API where it's like, oh, I'm feeling kind of overloaded. Oh, I'm kind of stressed out today. Then it would email a dev and it would say, this app API, whatever, it's been 5 times it's hit a threshold, like go take a look. And by doing so, what they used to do is the APIs would just say, I'm awake every morning. And we would all mark it as red. Like we put it in a folder, mark it as red. No one would look at it. And we had hundreds. So if one didn't chime in, we wouldn't notice. I'm like, let's do the opposite. And so basically the error handler would be like, hey, I didn't hear from this guy recently. I think something's wrong. And so we wrote basically our own custom messages.
Yep.
That works very well. However, we don't know how to write a custom error message for everything. So then we need to log. And so I have a lot of prescriptions over like what you should log, what you should not log. So for instance, do not log your social insurance number and your name, and also like your home address and your date of birth, etc., all together. But things we want to log, like someone tried to log in 10 times in under 10 seconds and failed each time. Humans don't type that fast. So
Right.
This might be bad. And so I'm a big fan of like creating more customized systems. Not everyone can do that though. And not everyone was a dev for twice as long as they were in security. So they're not that biased. But I also really like to use API gateways so that they can handle the authentication and the authorization for me. They can also do two things that I feel are really important, which is throttling and resource quotas. And so rather than letting it turn into a security incident, it's slowed it down and or stopped it in the meantime. But I feel like there is a thing that I want to bring up before I just like drill into tons of best practices. And so this is the thing that you brought up. Like if you aren't looking for it, you won't find it.
Right.
And we can teach software developers about security, but I find we get the best results if one, we have actual security tools that are looking for these things, and two, the security team writes out requirements of exactly what we want for your logging, exactly what we want for your design. So, you have an API, it's public, but people can only get to it through this API gateway. We've set these settings on it, and then it's going to log these certain things. We're going to have monitoring on it. And like if it goes past this, then it triggers an alert. I find that sending stuff to the SIM, like the Security Information and Event Management System, if you're creating custom messages that go there, that could be really cool. But if you're just letting all of your logs go there, you better make...
You get that alert fatigue again, right? You get the volume overload. If you're just logging to log, and we've seen a lot of that with organizations, they just say, oh, we're just going to throw every kind of medium, higher critical event to the SIM. And you just kind of expedited the problem now with two technologies. And I think that's also, you brought up a great point there. And I know there was a public question there that was interesting, where it says the best excuse I ever heard was from a team that said we're not collecting logs because of the European GDPR. And so, it's I'm glad everyone's kind of participating. Keep the chat coming as well. We love to respond to that if you have questions. But we love the insight as well. So logging is a real thing, but logging also makes sure that we need to have intelligent rules, customization, and important people that understand what am I looking at? How do I respond effectively to this? And I think to your point, you brought this up earlier, but it's a balance, right? You don't know what you don't know if you're not looking for it. And then it is a balance between security dev and who's owning that. Same thing with technology. There's a balance of get the technology in there, whether it's a gateway, whether you have API specific technologies, get the basic protections in place to start. Get it, or else it could be disastrous, and we don't want to see that for anybody. Actually, I think Cody, we are ready for the next poll. Tanya, I know this is your favorite question to ask everybody, so I'll tee it up and then I'll let you respond. But for everybody on the webinar here, do APIs require the same amount of security as a web application? We'll let that one. We'll let people submit this one, just true or false. So we'll get the results pretty quick here. But Tanya, I guess before we get the results, why do you love this question so much?
I love this question because, okay, so in my 1.5 years that I was a pen tester, before I discovered that what I truly love is AppSec, I don't know how to explain, but I was like, yeah, pen testing, this is awesome. Those people are movies. They're very cool. And then I was like, I'm so lonely in this data center and I'm cold. And there's wolves after me. There weren't really wolves, but it wasn't for me. But I tested one mobile app, and I remember I went into the scoping meeting and I said, okay, so there's the mobile app and there's this and that. I just want to check what the scope is. And I was like, listen, are all of the APIs in scope for this, or did you want to not have some? I made a list. Did I get all of them? And they're like, how did you see those? I'm like, I spent 1 second setting up a proxy on my phone. Like, it's really easy. And they're like, oh, we should hire her. She already hacked our APIs. I'm like, no, I didn't hack anything. I did not break any rules. I just proxied the connection, saw lots of calls, and was like, those are obviously APIs. And I want to know that it's okay that I talk to them. And they're like, you should get her. You should get her. And I was like, wow, okay. So, and I was not a hugely accomplished pen tester. And I'm just like, you can find these in 4 seconds. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like when I show the idea of an intercept proxy to the average software developer, they're just like, what? You could just pull back the JavaScript and look at my naked app. I'm like, yep. And I can say whatever I want to it. And they're just like, ah. Okay, let's look at the answers. False. No.
No, that's okay.
I still have work to do in this world.
No, it's a good. I mean, overall 94%, right? Almost 100%, where it does require the same type of level of security as everything you mentioned, right? Looking at even going back to kind of that statement I said, looking at even some of the different security organizations out there, or that create kind of the framework like the OWASP, and there is a reason why they created OWASP top 10, and then they started there's a bunch of them now. I was actually just looking at the Kubernetes top 10 for another project that I have to do, and so I think like making sure you're looking at your resources, doing education, understanding really what's in that environment. Again, it goes back to those basic fundamentals, but we talk about this so often in security, where it really is sometimes the fundamentals, right? We can get really technical, really detailed, really super flashy with a new shiny tool later. But if you don't understand what you don't have, you don't understand kind of what's on the application, where are the APIs, what is it connecting to? We can get into sometimes some hurdles in security. So that's important. But I think now we got just a little bit of time left, but I think now we're going to move a little bit more into the tips and best practices and a little bit of the recommendations. And I want to start with one. And I personally want to start with one that I know from people I've talked to, in specifically that's either new to API security in this whole realm of it. I mentioned this earlier when I kind of teed up the whole webinar, but there's sometimes some confusion about just the acronyms and sometimes the tools and technologies and how it plays into this grand scheme of what do I need to do. And I know when we think about, I'll rattle off some of the acronyms and then I'll kind of pose a question to you, Tanya. But we hear sometimes there's technologies about SaaS, right? Static application security testing. And then we hear DAST, which is dynamic. And then we hear SCA or SCA, which is software composition analysis. So we've got those, and we still have build pipeline technologies and all that good stuff. Then we hear all the other stuff around API gateways. And you mentioned that, and for authorization and authentication are very good. But then we've got WAFs, web application firewalls. And then you have a new sector on the right-hand side that says, and hopefully I'm not confusing everybody already, but then you have API protection platform technologies. And so there's a lot. And this can be, especially for security individuals that maybe, to your point, aren't necessarily have the same vocabulary or have the experience of working with all these different technologies. Maybe it wasn't part of their responsibility because engineering did it, as we mentioned earlier. How do we make a kind of a mess of all of this stuff? And I guess the question, Tanya, was not only how we make them, like, how do we untangle all this, but if you could design a perfect product or a perfect company and the products that that company would use, very interesting. And obviously there's a lot of it depends. We'll try not to say it depends. But what would you build? Why would you put those technologies in place? And I guess for our listeners here, what is something that they can take away? Like, what is critical and fundamental for them?
Oh my gosh, this is such
loaded question. Sorry.
Yeah. I think it depends too if you have money for human resources and if you have money for tools and if you have money for training. And so I feel like you need kind of all three. So ideally, you want to make sure you have enough security staff that can operate these tools and choose tools and make sure they actually are implemented correctly, because you and I have talked about people buying extraordinarily expensive tools and then not getting almost any of the value out of it because they didn't set it up right. But I'm going to put that aside.
Yep.
And then training for the security folks and the software developers, because I find with a lot of software developers, if you give them a tool, because some tools I think can very easily be used by them and the security team, and it doesn't necessarily need to be fully the security team's responsibility. If you train them how to write secure code, how to design secure applications and APIs, and you train them how to use a bunch of these tools, a lot of them will run off and do big chunks of your job for you, which is awesome. And then for tooling, so I have a lot of thoughts on this. Part of it depends on how big your budget is, but I really like to ensure I look at an application from kind of 3 different angles, if this makes sense. So I want to be able to look at the code that we actually wrote that's custom to us. And often you'll use a static analysis tool, but you could also use an API linter, right? Like there's a lot of different tools that can kind of help you look at the code quality, but specifically looking for security issues. And so this is like looking at written code, like if, then, else, etc. Then I want to look at the code that we didn't write, but we're still accepting the risk of because we put it inside our app. So that could be like a NuGet package if you do .NET or a Ruby gem. And it's like, is this Ruby gem a good Ruby gem? Are there lots of known vulnerabilities in it? Are those vulnerabilities potentially exploitable in the way we implemented and used that gem, right? And so software composition analysis can usually tell you, yeah, you have it. Some of them will try to tell you if they think there's an exploitable path or not, but most of them don't. And they're wrong sometimes. And then I like to look at a dynamic sort of interactive way. So sometimes it's DAS, sometimes it's IaaS, so interactive application security testing. Sometimes it's a pen tester that's really thorough and awesome, and they're just using a web proxy. And they're just, like, I've seen pen testers, they're like, I don't have a dynamic scanner. I just use my brain. And people keep making the same mistakes. So it's not that hard. And I'm like, oh, you're terrifying. You don't need any automated tools? I like to have help. But yeah, so if you can look at, like interacting with the application, looking at the code you wrote, looking at all the third-party things that are connected into your app, you can get like a really, really good idea. And then on top of that, if you want more protection, so let's say, you have a whole bunch of APIs and you've put them behind a gateway. So it's doing authentication and authorization for you. You accepting or like using that is you kind of doing risk transference. Does that make sense? So you're like, I need to do authentication and authorizations. Everyone in the world should not be able to call my API. Only the right people who we know who they are and they're allowed should get to talk to them. You could write that yourself, or you could buy a tried, tested, and true tool that does that. So I like to reuse things whenever I can. So if I can buy a product that will do identity for me, that sounds awesome. Writing an identity product's really hard. So I often suggest, like, if you can risk transfer or just use a product that's really well known and respected to do some of your security controls, life will be better. And so that depends on exactly what you need to do with your app, which things make sense to get. Then on top of that, if you have a very sensitive stuff, you could add a shield. That's what I call it. So that could be a runtime application security protection tool. That could be a WAF, a web application firewall, but basically an additional layer of defense that looks at things coming in. They're like, no, I don't think so, buddy. That looks malicious. That's not happening. So those are some of the things you can do, but I also really want to monitor it. And I really want to keep my eye on it and be alerted if there's stuff to look at. And if you create a custom system because you build tons of custom apps, that makes sense. Buying a system can make a lot of sense too, especially if you're a smaller shop. Like if you're Microsoft, you build everything. Like at Google, they build everything. Most of us aren't Microsoft and Google, and that's okay. We need stuff too, and it's okay to outsource to get something that we know has been tested quite thoroughly and works really well.
No,
I feel like I went all over the place there, Jeremy.
No, that's awesome. I think the viewers would definitely love that, because you almost broke it up like by, I hate using the word maturity, but really maturity levels, right? Of kind of security organizations, and kind of, we're all in different journeys, right? Every company's in a different journey, especially when it comes to AppSec, when it comes to API security. what we can afford, right? What resources we have. One of the big things that I've seen as well in my space is two things, really. One is around consolidation. You kind of said it. If you can have a vendor that's really good and respected, that can do multiple things really well, not just one thing really well and 5 things, something that's like, if they can do it really well, it's most likely worth the investment of going with that security vendor, that security technology that can cover things like identity or discovery or even real-time blocking, for example. The other kind of trend that I've seen as well is a lot of organizations are kind of doing, I know we've seen a lot of blogs, and I know I just posted one recently today about how do you do more with less, especially in 2023, as resource constraints, budget constraints are kind of taking a toll, and security is not immune, right? We're kind of facing this as well. Some people looked at it as do more with less. Some people even say do more with more, meaning how do I do more with already the security investments I've already made or the money that I've already spent? And one of the best practices and recommendations is for especially the smaller organizations that are just starting their journey or even maybe kind of struggling of trying to get this visibility and protection around their applications APIs, is looking at partners that not just provide a technology, but provide potentially a service as well, right? That can provide that outsourcing third-party response that can do some of the setup, some of the architecture, some of the configuration, learn your environment really well, acting as an extension of your security team, all the way to doing some of that pen testing, proactive threat hunting. That's ideal, right? Not every vendor is going to do that, but the more you can get out of that, the more avenues you can take. I think it's better for an organization, of course, versus the resources and budgeting of trying to do that yourself. Takes time, takes training, it takes a lot of money to hire somebody that's really, really experienced in kind of all this space.
Yeah, it is. It's really hard to hire people, Jeremy. It is really hard. And then you get them, and then you can't keep them because someone else offered them. Like one of my friends, I had recruited them to this company, and they're just about to sign. And then a company said, we will beat that by $100,000. And I was like, well, I don't know what to do. So yeah, I really, really agree with what you said. Someone said something in the chat that I thought was really good that I wanted to just point out. So someone was saying, in my humble opinion, the APIs don't need the exact same amount of security as a web app, because I believe they need more, because they don't have this front end that you can build protections into. So technically I should have voted false for that true or false question, because I implied in the question that it was like, do they need less security? But there are more options. There are so many products for securing APIs right now. Like, I don't even know the names of all the ones. There's so many. There's a lot.
And hopefully some of the tips and recommendations that we provide everybody and kind of what to take a look at, really, really helps. I do see there's another question in here. Can we get a summary of best practices for API security? That might be a kind of a good way to also wrap it up. In addition, though, I do want to say in the handouts, Tanya has posted a great resource for API best guidelines as well and best practices. So that definitely participant 401 will absolutely be a very, very good guidance from what you can download as well. But I know we've got a couple minutes left. So Tanya, I kind of want to ask one final question, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with kind of the summary. But where are we going? Like, sometimes it seems, I think as a security industry, we can be pretty pessimistic, I think, right? We're always looking at, what the next big breach is, or what are we doing? But I think we're having, as more conversations like this happen, as we talked so heavily about in the beginning about how we build that relationship with engineering and dev from a security standpoint, I personally do feel like things are getting better, maybe slower than we want. But I guess in your opinion, 2023, even to 2030, what are your predictions from an API security standpoint?
Predictions are hope. Someone said, please don't say chat GPT. I'm not. So I predict sort of two things, and then I have hope. So I'm predicting there's going to be a whole bunch more bad things that happen to companies. And then I hope, so like if let's say there's a couple of bad breaches that happen in 2023, I hope that'll light a little fire under some people's bums to take this more seriously. Like I am really hopeful that will happen. I feel certain that there will be a certain number of data breaches in 2023 because quite frankly, they're happening all the time. And it's disconcerting as like a citizen that uses the internet, but also as a security professional. But I also think that there are going to be a whole bunch more API security tools that pop up because the internet is just basically becoming dumb web front ends and tons of APIs with all the actual superpowers. And malicious actors have noticed this trend and they are on top of it. And I want all of us security professionals to be on top of it too. I think also there's going to be more best practices and more books that come out and more lessons and more meetups and more stuff, obviously, from OWASP with good guidance about how we can do better. And I'm hoping eventually, so this is the hope and dream that they start teaching this in school. They start teaching it in boot camps. When they teach you to make an API, they explain to you, okay, so you have to make sure, that you harden your definition file. If you're going to be like, this is a string and this is the name of my variable, that you also then prescribe what is allowed to be in that variable, how big or how small it can be, like what types of characters are cool, as opposed to making a block list of what's bad. I think that if we start teaching people that from the beginning, we're going to get a lot better results. I'm also hoping that there'll be way more security professionals. And I've been trying my best on a personal level to make that happen by making lots of courses available for free in the We Hack Purple community, by doing things like this, by writing books, etc. And I know people like you are working on this too. There's a lot of people who are like trying really hard to share information. And it's like, when we make like a course on the internet for free, it's like, I need you to learn this, please. Yeah, so I'm seeing that unfortunately there'll probably still be a bunch of bad stuff that happens, but I'm hoping, and I'm seeing companies take security way more seriously than ever before and exerting more effort. I want there to be less checking a box and more passion about making sure that a super high quality product also means a secure product.
Absolutely. I mean, that's super fantastic. I think one thing that resonated with me that you said was that I loved was the education part. Like even getting ahead of the curve of when we talk about universities or going through college degrees, whether it's engineering or even on the security side, educating early on from APIs and, how do we secure them and what does that mean? I mean, that's awesome, right? I actually haven't heard that. And I've asked a lot of people different predictions, right? It's typically, again, it's more about, we're going to have breaches. And I agree with that, right? We are. It's going to be, it's hopefully not catastrophic, but I think we are going to see a huge increase. And I even saw a stat today that it said by 2023, I think it was from IBM, that said 75% of all organizations, I think it was like 75 or 80%, everything, all traffic is going to be API. If not 99% by like 2030. And so while we're still, APIs aren't new, while the API security vendor space and kind of the conversations are starting to pick up even more, I guess the hopeful part to your point and taking the positive is we will have more education. We will have more guidance around this. We will probably have even more compliance frameworks that are going to require this when you bring a new vendor in. So super hopeful. And, as Tanya mentioned for everybody on the call, We Hack Purple is Tanya's company, provides awesome training. I've taken it myself. You can find out definitely in the handouts. There's a lot of great information, including from ThreatX as well, about what we do. We also have a ThreatX Academy as well, which is great for educating. So definitely take use of the handouts and the resource that we provide. I know for Tanya and I, we're definitely gonna be doing a lot more of these and different stuff. So please come check us out. We love to answer questions and, provide best practice recommendations as much as possible. But Tanya, I just want to say personally for me, thank you so much. This has been a extreme pleasure to kind of work with you, and I get to do this podcast and make sure that we're educating and giving these best practices and recommendations. So thank you so much, Tanya, personally for me.
Oh, thank you. This is my pleasure. Yeah, I had a great time. And I really liked a lot of the comments and questions in the chat. Also, someone said, yeah, the S in, GraphQL stands for security. I'm like, but there's no S. Just like in IoT, it's the S. Like, no. So although I do enjoy us teasing and making fun, I hope that one day that joke's old because it doesn't happen anymore. And the APIs are awesome. Oh, how can we invite Tanya for our company's visit? Send me an email at tanya@wehackpurple.com. Just send me an email. And I even answer them sometimes.
Awesome. With that being said, Cody, I believe you're still on. I know you've got a couple cool things you want to give away. So we'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. I really appreciate it, Jeremy. And Jeremy, Tanya, thank you both for joining us today. I know that I'm personally walking away learning a lot about this. So thank you for going into such detail. I would like to remind our audience that today's session was recorded. So should you want to rewatch, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. So we do still have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. So our winners are Amir G, Cassie C, Thomas L, and Sharath D. So to our 4 winners, please keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. But if you don't happen to see that, do check your spam folder. I'd like to thank ThreatX for sponsoring today's program, and to our audience who's been with us for the past hour. Thank you so much for joining us. I know Jeremy and Tanya really appreciate you being here, but we at Techstrong really appreciate you joining us today as well. We'd like to hear some feedback from you. So as soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. So let us know what you liked about today's program. Let us know what you'd like to see on future programs, or maybe just say hello, because I read those. Otherwise, we hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day. And Jeremy, Tanya, and to the whole ThreatX team, thank you all so much.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.